Hey guys, hope you're all doing well. We got a lot of stuff to talk about in this video, so let's get started. This video is mainly going to be focused and centered around Galatians 3:12. So let's look at it. It says, "And the law is not of faith, but the man that does them shall live in them." What exactly does that mean, that the law is not of faith? And why would Paul make such a statement? This is a verse that I have been studying off and on for the last few years. And I can tell you that I have read and heard just about every interpretation that's out there regarding this verse. I wanted to look at this verse objectively, making sure to get both sides. And when I say both sides, I'm talking about the pro-law and the anti-law sides. The pro-law would be Messianic, Torah observant, and so on, and the anti-law would be pretty much a good chunk of the world of Christianity today, as most of them teach that the law has been done away with. So let's start things off with a little bit of a roller coaster ride. Let's look at Romans chapter 14, and we're going to look at the very last verse. He says, "And he that doubts is damned if he eat, because he eats not of faith, for whatsoever is not of faith is sin." Can any of you name something off the top of your head that is not of faith? Galatians 3:12. The law is not of faith. I guess that means the law must be sin, right? Is it any wonder why a lot of the Christian world today thinks that? Can you imagine a person reading Romans 14 and then Galatians 3:12 here and putting these two verses together? Now, we already know that verses are quoted out of context all the time. Is it any wonder why people think the law is sin, or why it's bad? Just based on these two verses alone, I can understand why people would think that. Now, this ride doesn't stop. Let's keep going. Let's look at Romans 7. We're going to look at verse 7. "What shall we say then? Is the law sin? God forbid." Okay, well, that's interesting because he says anything that is not of faith is sin. The law is not of faith, therefore it must be sin, but no, the law is not sin. So at this point, what we have is anything that is not of faith, except for the law, is sin, even though the law is not of faith. Are you confused yet? Because the ride doesn't stop here. Let's keep going. Matthew 23, and we're going to look at verse 23. Yeshua says, "Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For you pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, and have omitted the weightier matters of the law, which are judgment, mercy, and faith." Yeshua says that faith is a weightier matter of the law. It is weightier, meaning that it is heavier and has a higher priority. Now that seems to be the complete opposite of what Paul said in Galatians 3:12. The law is not of faith, but faith is a weightier matter of the law. According to most of the Christian world, the law is not of faith means you can't mix law and faith together. The law does not require faith. Law and faith are opposed to one another. You can't mix them. But here, Yeshua says that faith is a weightier matter of the law. Clearly, there must be something else going on here. Otherwise, one of these two are lying. So I'd like to ask you a question. And I just want you to think about this question as we go through this video. Imagine you're sitting at the table with family or friends. Now, if your family is anything like mine, then any time you get together, doesn't matter if you're just visiting for a couple of minutes or you're staying to have a meal, the topic of the Bible is always going to come up. Now, that's probably because most of my family are believers. But let's just say you're sitting at the table with family. The topic of the Bible comes up, and you start talking about the law, faith, and all this stuff, and you speak up and you say, "Well, I have faith, and I also keep the law." Now, one of your family members or friends turns to you and says, "No, I don't think so. You're wrong, because Paul says the law is not of faith." And let's just say that this person even knows exactly where this verse is at. So they reach over to the table, grab the Bible, open it up, plop it down in front of you to Galatians 3:12, and point it out that the law is not of faith. And let's just say they go even further with it and say that they were watching Pastor What's-His-Face on TV, and he said the law is not of faith. And the moment you try to keep the law, you have fallen from grace. You can't mix law and faith together because Pastor What's-His-Face on TV said so. So here's the question I want to ask you. What would be your reply to that? How would you answer that? Would you know how to answer them? Or would you just throw a random verse at them? Now I'm going to tell you that throwing random verses across a table is not going to benefit anyone. You're not going to be changing anybody's mind by doing that. And throwing random verses at each other isn't going to win any arguments. So how would you answer a person that tells you the law is not of faith? So I want you to be thinking about that as we go through this video. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do is define the word faith. If you're going to make a claim that something is not of faith, then we first need to define what faith is. I am of the opinion that we don't need to look to outside sources to figure this out. There are plenty of examples in the Word of people having faith. So, seeing as how Abraham is often referred to as the father of the faith, then we should be able to look to him. So let's start with Hebrews chapter 11. Verse 8 says, "By faith Abraham, when he was called to go out into a place which he should after receive for an inheritance, obeyed, and he went out, not knowing whither he went. By faith he sojourned in the land of promise, as in a strange country, dwelling in tabernacles with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise." So we can read a little bit more about this in Genesis chapter 12. Verse 1 says, "Now the Lord said unto Abram, Get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you, and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless you, and curse him that curses you. And in you shall all families of the earth be blessed. So Abraham departed as the Lord had spoken unto him." This right here is an example of what faith is. Notice that it does not say that Abraham replied back to the Lord and said, "It's a really bad time right now. I've got this thing coming up. I got to go pick up a car next week. I got to do something with the kids. It's not really the best time right now. You're not giving me a lot of information. You're just telling me to depart and leave and go into a strange country. You're not really telling me much of anything. I'll tell you what, can you come back next month?" It doesn't say that. It just says Abraham departed as the Lord had spoken unto him. In Galatians 3, I think it's going to be verse 6. "Even as Abraham believed God, and it was accounted to him for righteousness." What exactly did Abraham believe? In order for Abraham to believe something, God would have had to have told him something first. Genesis 12 tells us, "I will make a great nation of you. I will bless you. I'm going to make your name great. All the families of the earth will be blessed because of you." Obviously, Abraham believed what God told him. He did not doubt it. This is an example of faith. Placing your trust in God and knowing that He's reliable, you can trust Him, He's not going to mislead you, and when He says He's going to do something, He's going to do it. Now, to confirm this, I'm going to show you another example of faith. Let's look at Numbers chapter 13. Now, I'm just going to give you the quick summary here of what's happening. This is where one man from each of the 12 tribes was chosen to be a spy, and then these 12 spies were sent into the land to spy it out. So basically, this is just a reconnaissance mission. All right, so we'll start here in verse 25. It says, "And they returned, they being the spies, from searching of the land after 40 days. And they went and came to Moses and to Aaron and to all the congregation of the children of Israel, and showed them the fruit of the land. And they told him and said, We came unto the land where you sent us, and surely it flowed with milk and honey, and this is the fruit of it. Nevertheless, the people are strong that dwell in the land, and the cities are walled and very great. And moreover, we saw the children of Anak there." Now this is talking about the giants. Verse 30. "And Caleb stilled the people before Moses and said, Let us go up at once and possess it, for we are well able to overcome it. But the men that went up with him said, We are not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we are. And they brought up an evil report of the land which they had searched unto the children of Israel, saying, The land through which we have gone to search it is a land that eats up the inhabitants thereof, and all the people that we saw in it are men of a great stature. And there we saw the giants, the sons of Anak, which come of the giants. And we were in our own sight as grasshoppers, and so we were in their sight. All right, so we'll go to the next chapter. And all the congregation lifted up their voice and cried, and the people wept that night. All right, so now in verse 2, the children of Israel are now murmuring and complaining against Moses and Aaron, saying, God has brought us out here to die. Why can't we just go back to Egypt? Did God really bring us out here to fall by the sword so that our wives and our children should be prey? It was much better for us in Egypt. And they said to one another, Let us make a captain, and let us return back to Egypt. So Moses and Aaron fell on their faces, and Joshua and Caleb rent their clothes. And they spoke unto all the company of the children of Israel, saying, The land which we passed through to search it, it is an exceeding good land. If the Lord delight in us, then he will bring us into this land and give it to us, a land which flows with milk and honey. Only rebel not against the Lord, neither fear the people of the land, for they are bread for us. Their defense is departed from them, and the Lord is with us. Fear them not. All right, so now in verse 10, the congregation want to stone him with stones. And it says, The glory of the Lord appeared in the tabernacle. So now in verse 11, God starts speaking. And it says, And the Lord said unto Moses, How long will this people provoke me? And how long will it be before they believe me? For all the signs which I have showed among them. Now he goes on to say that he's going to smite them and disinherit them. And if you keep reading, this is where he swears in his wrath that they shall not enter into his rest, and that their bodies are going to fall in the wilderness. So here in verse 22 he says, Because all those men which have seen my glory and my miracles, which I did in Egypt and in the wilderness, and have tempted me now these 10 times, and have not hearkened to my voice. Surely they shall not see the land which I swore unto their fathers, neither shall any of them that provoked me see it. But my servant Caleb, because he had another spirit with him, and has followed me fully, him will I bring into the land whereinto he went, and his seed shall possess it. This right here is another example of faith. Caleb had faith. Now I know the word faith does not appear here. But remember, faith is placing your trust in God and not doubting him. You know he's reliable to do what he said he's going to do. Now those other spies that came back and gave the evil report, they doubted God. They did not believe him. Remember back up here in verse 11, God says, How long will it be before they believe me? Those other spies did not believe God. They did not have faith. But Caleb had faith. Remember, Caleb said, Let's go take the land now. God is with us. We can do this. Now I'm going to confirm to you that this event here was all about faith. Let's look at Hebrews chapter 3. We're going to go down towards the bottom. We're going to start right here in verse 15. It says, While it is said, Today if you will hear his voice, harden not your hearts as in the provocation. For some, when they had heard, did provoke, howbeit not all that came out of Egypt by Moses. But with whom was he grieved 40 years? Was it not with them that had sinned, whose carcasses fell in the wilderness? And to whom swore he that they should not enter into his rest, but to them that believed not? Who did not believe? It was the other spies that came back. They did not believe, and when the congregation heard the evil report, they did not believe either. So we see that they could not enter in because of unbelief. Unbelief is the opposite of faith. They should have trusted God and believed that his words were true. Now let's go to the next chapter. It says, Let us therefore fear, lest a promise being left of entering into his rest, any of you should seem to come short of it. For unto us was the gospel preached, as well as unto them. Okay, hang on a second. Who is the them being spoken of here? It's them in the wilderness, the children of Israel. But the word preached did not profit them, not being mixed with faith in them that heard it. Caleb and Joshua had faith. The other spies did not. They doubted. And when the congregation in the assembly heard it, they didn't have faith either. Now there's something very interesting going on here in verse 2 that I just want to quickly point out. There are 4 things that are being mixed together. The first one is the law. I think that's pretty obvious. They had the law in the wilderness. The second thing would be grace. In Jeremiah 31:2, it says, "Those that were left of the sword in the wilderness found grace." The third thing would be the gospel. They had the gospel preached to them. And the fourth thing would be faith. So here we have 4 things that should have all been mixed together to profit them. The law, the gospel, grace, and faith. This is the very thing that the church world today says you're not supposed to do. Well, you're not supposed to mix faith and the law. You can't mix the law and grace. This here says that that's what they should have done in order for it to be of any benefit to them. So I'm going to show you one more example of faith. Let's look at 1 Corinthians 15. So we'll start in verse 12. "Now if Christ is preached that he rose from the dead, how say some among you that there is no resurrection of the dead?" All right, so somebody in Corinth had been spreading some rumors that there is no resurrection of the dead. But if there is no resurrection of the dead, then Christ is not risen. And if Christ is not risen, then our preaching vain and your faith is also vain. Verse 16, "For if the dead rise not, then is not Christ raised. And if Christ is not raised, your faith is vain. You are yet in your sins." Now the context here is about the resurrection of the dead. So let's not try to pull anything out of context. So he says, if Christ is not raised, then the dead are not going to be raised, and our faith is in vain. Now remember that we determined that faith is placing your trust in God and not doubting him. So basically what Paul is saying here is that if Messiah was not raised from the dead, then we are not going to be raised from the dead. And if that's the case, then God is unreliable, he can't be trusted, and he lied to us. So I'm going to retire to a beach with a cold drink in my hand, and everybody should just do whatever makes them happy. So I'm hoping by now that I have made it very clear as to what faith is. Faith is placing your trust in God and not doubting him. You believe his words to be true, that he's reliable, that you can trust him. And when he says he's going to do something, he's going to do it, even though you may not see it right away. You may not even see it in your lifetime. And even if it does happen in your lifetime, it may not happen the way you want it to. Now, I can also tell you what faith is not. Faith is not some mystical, magical force that allows you to just believe in something strong enough and it makes it true. That's not faith. That's called wishful thinking. Faith is not something that gets you a Ferrari and a Lamborghini and a private jet. I'm pretty sure that if you turned on Christian television and watched it for a few minutes, you'd come to the conclusion that faith would get you a Lamborghini or a Ferrari. Now, in some cases, you might have to send in a miracle seed of $777 within the next 7 minutes so God can bless you with $7 billion, 7 private jets, 7 yachts to sell the 7 seas, 7 Lamborghinis, a couple of Ferraris, and a nice big bag of cash waiting outside your front door. That is not faith. That's called greediness, wishful thinking, and it's also called you're being scammed. You need to stop giving your money to those people. Here is a question that we should be asking. Can you have faith in something that God never promised you? Can you trust God to give you something that he never said he was going to give you? Remember, faith is placing your trust in what God has told you or what he has done. You know his words are true. You're trusting him. You're not doubting him. How can you say that you have faith for a Ferrari, but God never made any promises about a Ferrari? How can you say that you have faith for $1 million when God never said that? You are placing trust into words that don't even exist. These are the type of questions that we should be asking. So I think it's pretty obvious that a lot of the church world today has really missed it when it comes to faith. All right, so now we have a much better idea of what faith is. So Galatians 3:12, the law is not of faith. So the next thing that I want to do is I want to talk about context, and we actually don't have to go too far with it. So we're going to start up here in verse 8. And the scripture, foreseeing that God would justify the heathen through faith, preached before the gospel unto Abraham, saying, In thee shall all nations be blessed. Now, if you have not already seen one of my other videos titled, What Does It Mean to Be Under the Law? You need to go watch that one because I'm going to be making some references to it as we make our way through the context here. So I will put a link to that video in the description in case you want to go watch it. Verse 9. So then they which be of faith are blessed with faithful Abraham. Okay, so I can already think of another question to ask. What does it mean to be of faith? What does that even mean? Verse 10. For as many as are of the works of the law are under the curse. For it is written, Cursed is everyone that continues not in all things which are written in the book of the law to do them. Okay, now there's something very interesting here going on, and I have yet to hear anyone talk about this. This is something that I have only recently seen, and as many times as I've read through Galatians, it's only been in the last couple of weeks that I've seen it. What Paul is doing here is he is showing a contrast between two different groups of people. Now, to make this a little easier to understand, what I'm going to do is go over into Photoshop, and I'm going to write down some notes here. So you're going to have to excuse my sloppy writing because I currently do not have a pen tablet, so I'm going to be writing this all out with a mouse. All right, so let's get a nice bright red color. All right, so in verse 9 he says, So then they which be of faith are blessed. We're going to refer to this first group as Group A. All right, so we're going to call them Group A. Now in verse 10 he says, For as many as are of the works of the law. So these people here are of the works of the law, and they are cursed. They are under a curse. And we're going to refer to them as Group B. All right, so two different groups. The contrast that Paul is trying to show here is that one group has faith, the other does not. Group A obviously has faith because he says they are of faith and they're blessed. But Group B, those who are of the works of the law, they do not have faith. Okay, how do I know that? He says that these people who are of the works of the law, they are also under a curse. If you are under a curse, then you are also under the law. You cannot be under one and not the other. These two are synonymous with each other. In other words, if you're under a curse, then you are also under the law. If you are under the law, then you are also under a curse. Now, what have we learned about the phrase under the law? Paul says that you're under the law until you have faith. Faith is the mechanism that releases you from being under the law. This is down here in verse 23. But before faith came, we were kept under the law, locked up until the faith which should afterwards be revealed. In other words, before faith comes to a person, we generally refer to those people as unbelievers or heathens. So before faith comes to the heathen, they are the ones who are kept under the law. Verse 25, but after that faith has come, in other words, after faith comes to a person and now they believe, they are no longer under the schoolmaster being the law. So seeing as how under the law is synonymous with being under the curse, then we should be able to take these people in Group B and insert them into verse 23. But before faith comes to those who are of the works of the law, they are under the law and also under a curse, locked up until they have faith. But after faith comes to those who are of the works of the law, then they are no longer under the law. These people up here that we labeled as Group B, who are of the works of the law, they clearly do not have faith. If these people did have faith, do you really think that they would be cursed? If they had faith, then they would be up here in Group A with those which are of faith. Clearly, this is a contrast between two groups of people. One group has faith, the other does not. Now, with that being said, we still haven't answered the question of what does it mean to be of faith? So now I want to start talking about the Greek. So let's start with verse 9. So it says, "So then they which are of faith." Now, I think I've mentioned this before in one of my other videos, but I'm just going to briefly touch on it again. If you're going to be using Blue Letter Bible, you need to be careful when using this center section, because this only gives you the root word, and over here on the left-hand side, sometimes a lot of words will be inserted, but it only shows up as one word. For example, it says, "they which be of," and that's telling you that the Greek word is ek. Well, I can tell you that ek does not mean they which be of. So you need to be careful when using this center section. So the word being translated as of is the Greek word ek. And the word for faith is the word pistios. So we have ek, pistios, of faith. What I want to concentrate on is this word ek. This word ek is a preposition, and it's telling me that there is an action that is taking place, and it is pointing at the origin from where this action had originated from. Now, this word ek is not the action, but it is telling me that there is some sort of an action taking place. There is some movement, something going on, and it is pointing at the origin from where this action started. Now, ek governs the genitive, and of course we can look at the word pistios here, and you see it says noun genitive. So let me give you a little illustration of what this word ek is doing. Let's say that you're standing out in your front yard and you're talking with your neighbor, and some little punk kid down the street decides that he's going to try to hit you with a football. So he throws the football at you and it hits you in the head. So you pick yourself up and you look at your neighbor and you ask him, which direction did that just come from? And your neighbor, being the word ek, lifts his hand and points down the street, 2 doors down. That's what the word ek is doing. Ek is pointing at the origin from where an action started. Now, unfortunately, here in this verse, Paul did not list any specific action. He says, "So then they which be of faith." Well, that's rather general and vague. There's no specific action listed there. So I wanted to look around to see if I could find any other places with this type of wording to see if maybe there was an action. And sure enough, I found a place. So Romans 14, verse 23. "And he that doubts is damned if he eat, because he eats not of faith. For whatsoever is not of faith is sin." Would you like to take a guess at what Greek words are used there? If you said ek, you would be correct. So here we have ek pistios and ek pistios, of faith. Now remember that ek is telling us that there's an action taking place. What is the action? The action is eating. And he that doubts is damned if he eat. Okay, why? Because he did not eat, there's the action, he did not eat of faith. His eating did not originate from faith. For whatsoever is not originating from out of faith is sin. That is what this word ek means. So whoever this person here obviously has no faith when he eats. He's doubting. So now let's go back to Galatians 3 again. And now we're going to go to verse 10. For as many as are of the works of the law. Would you like to take a guess at what word is used there for of? Here the word ek looks a little different. It's pronounced x. And the reason why it looks different is because it precedes a vowel. If we look at the very next word, it's the word for works. And the very first letter is a vowel, epsilon. So let me quickly show you what's happening here. So here we have the Greek ek. All right, and this letter right here is epsilon. And this letter here would be kappa. Now, whenever you see ek, you need to look at the very next word that comes after it. So if ek precedes a vowel, which in the case of Galatians 3:10, it precedes the epsilon, then what we have to do is drop the kappa and we insert the letter kasi. And it looks something like that. And the way it's pronounced is like K-S-E-E, ksi. Think of the word taxi, right? T-A-X-I. And the X and the I is what you want to concentrate on. So let's remove the T and the A, and we end up with C. So try to say taxi without the T and the A, and that's how you pronounce this letter. Now, even though this word ek appears differently here, it does not mean that the meaning has changed. It means the same thing, okay? So I don't want anybody to think that the meaning has now changed and that ek and x mean two completely different things. It's only changed in appearance because it precedes the vowel epsilon. All right, so he says, for as many as are of the works of the law. Now we know that ek, or in this case x, tells us that there's an action taking place, but there's no specific action that's listed. But we do know that it's pointing to the origin from where this action is originating from, which would be the works of the law. So now we need to ask a question. What exactly are the works of the law? Now there is a little bit of a debate on this. There are those that say the works of the law is referring to the sacrificial laws, anything that pertains to the sacrifices and the offerings. There are those that say this is referring to ceremonial laws, whatever those may be. There are those who say that this is referring to the man-made laws of the Pharisees, otherwise known as the oral law. There's also those that say that this is just referring to the law of God as a whole. But where I currently stand on this is a little different. I believe that it's very possible that the works of the law is referring to a short list of laws and commandments that are found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So I'll put some information about this in the description to this video so you can check it out. But the Dead Sea Scroll documents is the 4QMMT, and that stands for miqtzat ma'aseh haTorah. So this would be the works of the law. Now, what I want to point out is something that is written here towards the end of it. It says, "Now we have written to you some of the works of the law, those which we determined would be beneficial for you and your people, because we have seen that you possess insight and knowledge of the law. Understand all these things and beseech him to set your counsel straight and so keep you away from evil thoughts and the counsel of Belial. Then you shall rejoice at the end time when you find the essence of our words to be true, and it will be reckoned to you as righteousness, in that you have done what is right and good before him to your own benefit and to that of Israel." These are the words right here that stood out to me. And it will be reckoned to you as righteousness. So here we have a short list of laws and commands, and they're told if you do these things, it will be reckoned to you as righteousness. And then here we have Paul writing to the Galatians, and he says, Abraham believed God, and that is what was counted to him for righteousness. So these people here who are doing the works of the law, if that's what this is referring to, this short list that's listed here in the Dead Sea Scrolls document, then it's no wonder why he actually quotes from the law and says that they are cursed. First of all, they obviously do not have faith. If they did, then they wouldn't be doing these things with the intent that it's going to justify them or make them righteous. But then he says, "For it is written." Now he's going to be quoting from Deuteronomy 27. "Cursed is everyone that continues not in all things which are written in the book of the law to do them." So here we have the works of the law as found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is not the entire law of God. It's only just a very short list of things for these former Gentiles to do. And then here we have Paul writing to them to say, you're going to be cursed unless you do all things which are written in the book of the law to do them. You got to do everything that applies to you. You can't just do some short list thinking that that is going to be counted to you as righteousness. So this is where I currently stand on this issue with the works of the law. Alright, so let's keep reading. We'll move on to verse 11. "But that no man is justified by the law in the sight of God, it is evident, for the just shall live by faith." Now, a few years ago, this verse was a little confusing to me because it seems to be a contradiction compared to something else he said. So let's look at Romans chapter 2. We're going to look at verse 13. "For not the hearers of the law are just before God, but the doers of the law shall be justified." So here we have the doers of the law shall be justified versus no man is justified by the law in the sight of God. These two verses almost seem to be opposed to one another. You can't be justified by the law. Well, those that do the law will be justified. So how are we supposed to make sense of this? I'm going to draw a little illustration for you to show how we're to make sense of these two verses. Alright, so let's say that this right here is you. And you're going to have a frown on your face because you are currently unjustified or unrighteous. And over here we'll have the law. Alright, so here's the law. And there's some things written on the law. Alright, so this is the law. And up here we have God. And God's got a smile on his face because he wants to justify somebody. Now, for the sake of this example, we need to make justification into something tangible that we can see. So I'm going to make justification this circle, and we'll put a J in the middle so we know what it is. So in Galatians 3:11, Paul says, "No man is justified by the law." So that means that justification does not come from the law. Now if we look at Galatians 3:8, Paul says, "And the scripture foreseeing that the law would justify the heathen through faith." No, wait a minute, that's not what it says. God will justify the heathen through faith. That means justification originates from God. It does not originate from the law. So justification comes from God. But Romans 2:13 says that those that do the law will be justified. Okay, well, this guy right here, is he doing the law? If he is, then he will be justified. But if he's not, then he's not going to be justified. Now I know Galatians 3:8 says God will justify the heathen through faith. So obviously this guy has to have faith. But if a person has faith, but they're not doing the law, do you think that they're going to remain in that state of being justified? What if this person is doing the law, but they don't have faith? If a person is doing the law, but they don't have faith, then they're going to fit into group B, which are of the works of the law. They don't have faith. That means they're going to be under the law and they're under a curse. But what about the person that's not doing the law but has faith? Clearly you have to have faith. But if you're not a doer of the law, then I can only guess that you're going to be back under the law and under a curse because of your disobedience. So this is how we make sense of those two verses. No man is justified by the law. Okay, why not? Because justification does not originate from the law. It originates from God. God is the one that justifies people. The law does not justify people. But it is only those who are doing the law that God will justify. So I'm hoping that this little illustration here will help make sense of those two verses. All right, so let's go back. And verse 11, no man is justified by the law in the sight of God. It is evident, for the just shall live by faith. All right, this is a quote from Habakkuk. Now, I don't want to get too involved with Habakkuk right now, but I will quickly go there just so we can get a little bit of context. All right, so verse 4, behold, his soul which is lifted up is not upright in him, but the just shall live by his faith. That's where this comes from. So what I want to do is I want to back up just to get a little bit of context to see how faith is applied to the situation that Habakkuk was seeing. So it starts off with the burden which Habakkuk the prophet did see. So what I'm going to do is recommend that in your own time you read through this. I'm just going to give you the quick version. In chapter 1, Habakkuk is going to see a vision. In the first couple of verses, he's crying out to God because there's a lot of violence and a lot of unrighteousness that is going on in the land, a lot of wickedness. He says the law has been slacked, judgment does never go forth, the wicked compass about the righteous, wrong judgment is always proceeding. Now in verse 5, God answers and starts speaking. Behold you among the heathen, and regard, and wonder marvelously, for I will work a work in your days, which you will not believe, though it be told you. For lo, I raise up the Chaldeans, that bitter and hasty nation, which shall march through the breadth of the land to possess the dwelling places that are not theirs. So if you continue to read on, God is going to raise up the Chaldeans to use them as the instrument of judgment, because judgment is going to come to the people, to the children of Israel. In this case, I think it's Judah. So God is going to use the Chaldeans to bring judgment upon the land. Now, as you make your way through this chapter, he goes on to say that he's going to judge the Chaldeans. It's not really going to be a good time for anyone. There's going to be a lot of judgment taking place. And this is the vision that Habakkuk sees. So now we go to chapter 2. I will stand upon my watch and set me upon the tower, and will watch to see what he will say unto me, and what I shall answer when I am reproved. And the Lord answered me and said, write the vision, and make it plain upon tables, that he may run that reads it. For the vision is yet for an appointed time, but at the end it shall speak and not lie, though it tarry, wait for it. Because it will surely come, it will not tarry. Behold, his soul which is lifted up is not upright in him, but the just shall live by his faith. So the Lord answered Habakkuk and said, write down the vision that you had seen, and make it plain upon tables, that he that sees it and reads it may run. For the vision of judgment coming is yet for an appointed time. But at the end it shall speak and not lie, though it tarry, wait for it, because it will surely come, it will not tarry. The context here is about judgment coming. And God is telling Habakkuk, write this vision down. This vision of judgment, the judgment that I'm going to send, it's for an appointed time. Though it tarry, wait for it, because it will surely come, it will not tarry. So what does this have to do with faith? Well, remember, we determined that faith is not doubting God. Faith is placing your trust in God and knowing that he's reliable and that whatever he says, it's going to happen. You're either going to believe him or doubt him. Now, in the context of Habakkuk, Habakkuk has seen this vision. Judgment is coming. It's not going to be good. And God says, write it down. It's for an appointed time. Wait for it, because it will surely come. So within the context, the just shall live by his faith, could be interpreted as the just shall live by trusting God and knowing that when God says judgment is coming, it's coming. So once again, we see an example of what faith is. Faith is trusting God. In the context, God told Habakkuk, wait for it. In other words, this judgment that I'm sending, you may not see it right away. It may not happen in the next 10 minutes. It may not even happen in the next 10 days, 10 weeks, or 10 months. But wait for it, because it is coming. At that point, the ball is in Habakkuk's court. He's either going to doubt what God has said, which is the opposite of faith, or he's going to trust him, which is what faith is. So Paul says in Galatians 11, no man is justified by the law in the sight of God. It is evident, for the just shall live by trusting in God and not doubting him. So now we get to the issue at hand. Galatians 3:12. And the law is not of faith, but the man that does them shall live in them. So I want to talk about the Greek again, because it says, and the law is not of faith. Would you like to take another guess at what Greek word is used there for of? If you said ek, you would be correct. Here we have ek, pistios. And the law is not ek, faith. The law is not originating from faith. Now, a while back, as I was studying this verse, I wasn't really getting anywhere with it. So I decided to take a little bit of a break. I didn't give up on it, but I just needed to take a break. And I moved on to another topic, which was things offered to idols. Are we allowed to eat things that have been sacrificed to idols? Now, if any of you have ever done a study on that topic, at some point you're going to make your way to 1 Corinthians where Paul talks about it. So I want to go to 1 Corinthians chapter 6. And I want to go down here to verse 12. You've probably had this verse thrown at you a few times. He says, all things are lawful unto me, but all things are not expedient. All things are lawful for me, but I will not be brought under the power of any. Now this same thing is found in chapter 10. So I'm going to forward over to chapter 10. I want to go down to verse 23. Once again, all things are lawful for me, but all things are not expedient. All things are lawful for me, but all things edify not. Now, I've had this verse thrown at me a few times because people say we could do whatever we want now because all things are lawful. You want to have a big old ham sandwich with bacon and you want to drink some blood or eat some snakes or roaches? All things are lawful. It was at this time that I discovered that the Greek manuscripts that we have today, where our English Bibles come from, those manuscripts do not contain any punctuation. That means there's no commas, no periods, no question marks, no exclamation marks, no parentheses, no brackets, no quotations, none of that. That means that whoever is doing the translating into English, they're going to have to place the punctuation like commas and periods where they think it fits best. And for the most part, they did a pretty good job, but there are some places that need correction. And this is one. You see, Paul is not the one making the claim that all things are lawful. This is what the Corinthians were saying. The Corinthians were the ones that were saying all things are lawful. More than likely, in the letter that they wrote to him, this is probably one of the claims that they made. And what Paul is doing here is he is quoting them. There's another Bible website that I often use called Bible Hub. And if we do a search for 1 Corinthians, and it doesn't matter, you can do 6:12 or you can do 10:23, either one. Right off the bat, the NIV says, I have the right to do anything you say. The New Living Translation says, you say, I am allowed to do anything. All things are lawful for me is in quotations. Everything is permissible for me is also in quotations. Notice that all of these have the words all things are lawful or permissible in quotations. Clearly, Paul did not say that all things are lawful. This is what the Corinthians were saying. And I'm going to show you another example of this. We need to go to chapter 7. So 1 Corinthians chapter 7. He says, "Now concerning the things whereof you wrote unto me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman." Now I've had some people tell me, Paul says it's good for a man not to touch a woman. The truth is that Paul did not make this statement. This is the statement that the Corinthians had said when they wrote to him. So verse 1 should be translated as, "Now concerning the things whereof you wrote unto me, you say, quote, it is good for a man not to touch a woman." End quote. You see, this is what the Corinthians were doing to avoid fornication. Their way of avoiding it was, just don't touch a woman. And Paul in verse 2 says, okay, that's not bad, but nevertheless, if you really want to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife, and let every woman have her own husband. But because the quotations are missing here in the King James, we think Paul is the one that's saying this, when in fact, he's not. So as I was looking through 1 Corinthians on the topic of things offered to idols, and I came across this, all things are lawful, I saw something interesting. So let's look at 1 Corinthians 6:12 again. All things are lawful unto me, but. Do you see that word but? In Greek, the word is all, and it comes from the word ӓλλα. So ӓλλα here looks a little different than the word all, and the reason why is because the alpha has been dropped on the end. Whenever you have this word ӓλλα, if it precedes a vowel, the alpha will be dropped on the end. So we look at the very next word. The first letter of that word is omicron, that's a vowel, so the alpha on the end is dropped. So whether it's ӓλλα or all, it means the same thing. It just looks different because the alpha has been dropped because it precedes a vowel. I want to take a couple minutes to talk about this word ӓλλα, because most places where this word is found, it's generally translated as but. But the word but is a very general and very weak translation because it does not do this justice, and it doesn't explain what's happening here. The word ӓλλα is used to correct or replace what precedes it. This means that something is wrong or false and needs to be corrected. Now this would make good sense in a dialogue situation where one person says something and they get it wrong, and then the other person has to speak up to correct it. If we were to look at all of the places where this word ӓλλα is used, a lot of them are used in a monologue type of situation, where the speaker is correcting themselves. So what that means is that the person who is speaking would intentionally make a wrong statement in order to, I guess you could say, manufacture the opportunity to correct it before anyone even had a chance to bring it up. I'll give you an example of where this takes place. Let's look at a very popular verse in Matthew 5. Matthew 5:17. Think not that I am come to destroy the law or the prophets. I am not come to destroy, but to fulfill. That word but is ӓλλα. So the word ӓλλα basically means on the contrary. Whatever precedes ӓλλα would be false, and then what comes after ӓλλα would be the correction. So here, ӓλλα being translated as on the contrary, Yeshua would be saying, think not that I am come to destroy the law of the prophets. I am not come to destroy. Oh no, on the contrary, I have come to fulfill. You see, what precedes ӓλλα would be the false statement that needs to be corrected. In this case, it is, he has come to destroy the law. Followed by ӓλλα, which means on the contrary. Then comes the correction, to fulfill. I'll give you another example where this takes place. In Romans 3, verse 31. Do we then make void the law through faith? God forbid. Yea, we establish the law. Now here the word ἀλλά is translated as yea. So here we have ἀλλά right there, which means on the contrary, even though it's being translated as yea. You gotta love the old King James English. So he says, do we then make void the law through faith? God forbid. On the contrary, we establish the law. So remember, what precedes the ἀλλά would be the false statement, which is making void the law through faith, even though it's taking form of a question here. Then immediately following the ἀλλά, we have the correction, we establish the law. The problem with this word ἀλλά is that in most places it's just translated as but. And if I can take a second to paraphrase an old Hallmark slogan, but is the conjunction that you would use when you don't care enough to send the very best. And that's exactly what's happening here. Part of the problem is that no one really uses this type of language anymore. I can't remember the last time I was having a conversation with somebody and they replied with, on the contrary. You really don't hear anyone using that type of language. It's kind of funny when I think about it, because the other day I was watching an episode of Stargate SG-1 and this was part of the dialogue.
No pressure, Carter. Plenty of time.
On the contrary, O'Neill.
Lots and lots of time.
So of course, I hear him say, on the contrary, and immediately I was reminded of ӓλλά. So to make this a little easier to understand, I put together a little chart. So on the left-hand side, we have the claim. In the middle, we have on the contrary, and on the right-hand side, we have the correction. Now, the very first claim that we saw was all things are lawful. 1 Corinthians 6 and 1 Corinthians 10. All things are lawful. That's the claim. It was immediately followed by all, on the contrary, which was immediately followed by the correction. All things are not beneficial. Now, as I was looking through this, there was another verse that popped into my mind, and I had to check it out to see if it was anything close to this. So let's look at Romans 14, and we want to look at verse 20. For meat destroy not the work of God. All things indeed are pure or clean, but it is evil for that man who eats with offense. All things indeed are pure, but... Would you like to take a guess at what word is used here for but? ἀλλά. On the contrary. So we have another claim. All things are clean, which is immediately followed by ἀλλά. On the contrary, which is immediately followed by the correction. It is evil for that man who eats with offense. Are you beginning to see a pattern here of the way the sentence structure is laid out? Claim, on the contrary, correction. Claim, on the contrary, correction. So let's go back to Galatians 3, and let's look at verse 12. And the law is not of faith, but. There's the Greek word all, which means on the contrary. Remember that whatever precedes ἀλλά, in this case all, because it comes before the vowel omicron, whatever precedes it is a false statement that either needs to be replaced or corrected. This means that the claim that the law is not of faith is a false claim. It is not true. Because the ἀλλά here, or all, is telling me that it is false. So Paul says the law is not of faith, ἀλλά, on the contrary, and then he's going to quote from Leviticus 18:5. The man that does them shall live in them. Now we need to ask a question. Does Leviticus 18:5 prove that the law is not of faith? Or does it prove that the law is of faith? Let's go look at it. Now this is what I refer to as the fornication chapter, because he's going to tell them that they're not to do what the Canaanites and the Egyptians were doing, And then he's going to give them a long list of a lot of different sexual sins. So let's start with verse 1. And the Lord spoke unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and say unto them, I am the Lord your God. After the doings of the land of Egypt, wherein you dwelt, you shall not do. And after the doings of the land of Canaan, where I am bringing you, you shall not do. Neither shall you walk in their ordinances. You shall do my judgments, and keep my ordinances, to walk therein. I am the Lord your God. You shall therefore keep my statutes and my judgments, which if a man do, he shall live in them. I am the Lord. Now, if you skim through this chapter, the word faith is not mentioned here. But remember, faith is not wishing for a Lamborghini or hoping that God is going to somehow send an angel to your front door with a bag full of cash. That's not faith. Faith is trusting God and not doubting Him, and knowing that He's reliable and He's not going to mislead you. Now, as I was reading through this, there was something else that stood out to me that reminded me of something that's written in Ezekiel. So let's look at Ezekiel 18. All right, so this is talking about a man here that has not oppressed anyone. He's restored the debtor his pledge. He's not violent. He hasn't lifted up his eyes to the idols of the house of Israel. He hasn't defiled the neighbor's wife. Verse 9 says, has walked in my statutes and has kept my judgments to deal truly. He is just. He shall surely live. And if we scroll down a little bit, verse 21, but if the wicked will turn from all his sins that he has committed and keep all my statutes and do that which is lawful and right, he shall surely live, he shall not die. So Leviticus 18:5 says, keep my statutes and my judgments, and you shall live. What does Ezekiel 18 say? Has walked in my statutes and has kept my judgments, he shall live. Statutes and judgments, and you will live. Leviticus 18:5, statutes and judgments, and you shall live. Now it's worded a little differently here because he says you shall live in them, and Ezekiel doesn't have the in them, it just says you shall live. But what I'm seeing here is basically the same thing. God is saying, obey me, and you will live. So how does faith play into all of this? Well, remember, we determined that faith is placing your trust in God and not doubting Him. If God tells you something, or if He says something, you're either going to believe Him or you're going to doubt Him. So God says, hey, just obey me and you will live. Now the ball's in your court. Are you going to doubt Him or are you going to trust Him? If you're going to trust God and have faith, then you're also going to obey Him. If God says, obey me and you will live, and you don't believe what God says, that's doubt, then you're not going to obey Him. Doubt and unbelief are usually associated with disobedience, and faith is associated with obedience. If you have faith, meaning you trust God and you believe what He said is true, you're going to obey Him. So in Galatians 3:12, Paul is quoting from the law to prove that it is of faith. So it says the law is not ek of faith. Remember, ek points at the origin from where an action is taking place. What is the action? The action is the law, but that tells me that means obedience to the law. So your obedience to the law is not originating from faith. ἀλλά, or all. On the contrary, the man that does them shall live in them. This statement here that obedience to the law does not originate from faith is a false statement. You remember in Romans 14, verse 23? Whatsoever is not ek, originating from faith, is sin. That includes our obedience to the law. Our obedience to the law, if it is not originating from faith, it is sin. You gotta have faith. In other words, what Paul is saying is that the law has to be obeyed from out of faith. And that certainly does fit the context. Remember, up a few verses, Verse 10, these people here, they are obeying the works of the law, but they don't have faith. That's why they're cursed. That's why they're under the law. These people up here in verse 9, they are blessed. These people here are of faith. They are doing an action, which is not listed here, but they are doing some form of action that is originating from faith. What do you think that is? It has to be obedience to the law. Because this statement here, that obedience to the law is not originating from faith, is a false claim. ἀλλά, on the contrary. Paul quotes from the law to prove that the law has to be obeyed from out of faith. So in conclusion, there are only two possible solutions to this problem here in Galatians 3:12. The first solution is that Paul is not the one making the claim that the law is not of faith. He's just quoting what the Galatians had been saying. Now, if that is not what's happening here, then the only other solution would be a monologue type of situation, where Paul is the one making the claim, but he purposely made a false claim so that he could immediately correct himself before they even had a chance to bring it up. It's either one or the other, but regardless of which one it is, both of them agree that the law has to be obeyed from out of faith, which is in complete agreement with what we read about earlier in Hebrews, where the people had the law, they heard the gospel, they had grace, but it was of no benefit to any of them because they did not do it from faith. They should have been obeying from out of faith. So remember the chart I showed you a few minutes ago. There's an empty slot at the bottom. The claim here would be the law is not of faith, which is immediately followed by all. On the contrary, which is immediately followed by the correction. The man that does them shall live in them. By now, this pattern should be very clear. Claim, on the contrary, correction. Claim, on the contrary, correction. Claim, on the contrary, correction. Now remember back at the beginning of this video, I asked you a question. I said, if you were sitting down with family and the topic of the Bible come up, and you were to say that you do keep the law, but you also have faith, and someone was to say, Paul says the law is not of faith. Even Pastor What's-His-Face on TV with the expensive suit and drives around in a Rolls Royce and flies around in his private Learjet. Even he said the law is not of faith. How would you answer them? What would be your reply? This right here would be my reply. The law is not of faith is a false claim, because it's immediately followed by all, which means on the contrary, which is then followed by the correction. The law has to be done from faith. Obedience to the law is the action, and the word ek is pointing from where that action originated from. Pistios, faith. Our obedience to the law has to originate from faith. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap up this video. I hope that I have made it very clear as to what's happening here. Paul did not say that the law is not of faith. That is a false claim. It is very clear by now, after looking at the Greek, after looking at other examples and sources, that our obedience to the law has to originate from out of faith. So if you have any comments or questions, feel free to comment below. And as always, thank you for watching.